Mont Vernon, New Hampshire. The 2,500 people living nestled among the low hills of south-central New Hampshire are proud of Mont Vernon for its beauty, its charm, and its safety. Like most of northern New England, Mont Vernon enjoys a low crime rate. Violent crime is nearly non-existent in the rural hideaway, and the last murder to occur involved a drunken bar fight in 1840. It's a quiet community that boasts a single schoolhouse, an annual kids fishing derby, and a town building inspector who lists his home phone number on the town website for residents to inquire about permits. In 2004, David Cates moved to Mont Vernon with his wife Kimberly and 6-year-old daughter Jamie. Their modest ranch home sat on the narrow gravel Trow Road which, even today, is heavily wooded and secluded. Houses were spread so far from each other that neighbors could neither see nor hear one another. And streetlights didn't reach this far into town. One of the closest neighbors was a family-owned sustainable chicken farm, which still supplies free-range eggs to local restaurants. People described the Cates family as down-to-earth, outgoing, and simply good people, qualities which helped them fit right in with the others in Mont Vernon. Kimberly was an extrovert who loved the outdoors and was an active runner. She worked as a nurse in 2 local hospital systems in their labor and delivery and emergency departments. Co-workers enjoyed sharing a shift with her, as her outgoing nature, confidence, extraordinary organization skills, and quick thinking made her a valuable teammate in an environment that was often fast-paced and chaotic. Jamie was considered mature, wise beyond her years. She was a soccer player, a straight-A student, and loved taking karate classes. David was an engineer, a hard worker, and was devoted to his family. Kimberly and Jamie were especially close with one another. They were often described as being inseparable, more like best friends than mother and daughter. They had recently taken to learning how to kayak together in the many lakes, ponds, and rivers in New Hampshire. Disciples of Destruction. By October 2009, 17-year-old Stephen Spader, Jr. from neighboring Brookline, New Hampshire had already dropped out of high school. A self-described sociopath, he had an obsession with murder and openly talked about wanting to kill people, for fun. Stephen claimed to friends and acquaintances that he was a prospective member of the infamous Crips gang, had killed 28 people, had participated in drive-by shootings in Massachusetts, and had disposed of bodies in local quarries. He formed his own brotherhood of other young men with similar interests. Dubbed the Disciples of Destruction, the brotherhood was meant to be a serious business. Stephen went as far as to name himself president, assign friends to other officer positions, and develop codes and bylaws for group members. The DOD consisted of only a few of Stephen's friends, but he had a vision of it becoming larger and eventually making quite a bit of money. Only a month after officially forming DOD, Stephen had plans for the group's first initiation. He and the other prospective members would carry out a home invasion complete with robbery, torture, chloroform, and murder. It was important to Stephen that everyone prove themselves by participating in every aspect of the crime. He needed to be sure that nobody in his gang would be pussies, or people who could just talk the talk. Dig. Quote. Stephen began discussing the planned invasion in detail with his friends and fellow DOD members, Christopher Gribble, Quinn Glover, and William Marks. Over the next few weeks, Stephen couldn't stop talking about roasting and eating people, putting heads on stakes, and causing a huge scene for the media. while Christopher, Quinn, and Billy were friends with Stephen. None was as close with him as Autumn Savoy. Stephen considered his friend Autumn to be more like his brother, and the feeling was mutual. Autumn was well aware of Stephen's tough talk about gang membership and murder, but didn't take it very seriously. When Stephen invited Autumn to join him with Christopher, Billy, and Quinn in the Dodge, Autumn declined, but he did offer to design the gang's logo. The job. Late on the evening of October 3, 2009, Stephen told Autumn that he was going to be busy that night, doing a job. Stephen had said that he planned to kill someone on this job, but Autumn didn't believe him. He assumed that the job would just be a robbery. Stephen already had a house picked out. It was isolated, dark, and random. He had no way to know in advance. But the home's security system was also disconnected. Each young man had chosen a weapon, and they had all agreed that they would kill anyone inside. The only obstacle was their lack of chloroform. Despite lots of internet searches and attempts to surreptitiously gather the ingredients, they weren't able to get their hands on the required acetone. They would have to do without. At around 3 a.m. on October 4, 2009, the four young men, armed with a large machete, some knives, and iPods for illumination, approached the dark and sleepy Kate's home on Trow Road. Since Billy was the smallest, the others lowered him through a basement window that they had broken. The plan was for him to get upstairs and let the rest in through a door. But he got disoriented and lost in the dark basement and couldn't get to the upstairs. Undeterred, Stephen broke in through a window and found Billy in the basement. They cut the power to the house at the circuit breaker and turned on their iPods to help them navigate. Stephen and Christopher made their way through the dark home, down a long hallway from the kitchen to the bedroom. David Cates was not in his bed with his wife that night. He was traveling out of state for work. Instead, Kimberly and Jamie, the mother-daughter duo who were so close and so connected, were curled up sleeping together. Billy followed closely behind the others, but remained in the bedroom doorway while Stephen and Christopher entered, hovering above the sleeping mom and child. Quinn was further away, but still within earshot, close enough to describe the horrors that came next. Kimberly startled awake when Christopher and Stephen loudly entered her room. In the dark, she called out to Jamie to see if it was her making the noise. As she reached across the bed to turn on the non-functioning light, Stephen used both hands to slam the machete down onto her body. Over and over, sparing not an inch. The thuds of each impact were audible down the long hallway. Panicked, Kimberly begged for the attack to stop. She screamed for Jamie to run, and told her that everything would be okay. Billy watched the attack from the bedroom doorway. Quinn tried to remain distant, but the noise of the machete was too much. He covered his ears when it became too gruesome. He was too cowardly to intervene and stop the attack, although he knew it was in his power to save Kimberly. Meanwhile, Christopher had his sights set on Jamie, who was desperately trying to escape the attack. He threw her into a large window and she fell in a heap to the floor. He stabbed her in the throat and chest, and cut her repeatedly while she lay on the floor fighting for her life. Christopher and Stephen both kicked Jamie all over as she lay bleeding on the floor. And Stephen hit her with his machete, fracturing her skull. Thinking the job was done, Stephen left the bedroom and ran, elated, to Quinn in the other room. He excitedly told Quinn what had happened, exclaiming that it was great that they had just broken up a family. Stephen was euphoric at this point. and couldn't contain his excitement in retelling how Kimberly had been startled awake by the attack. Quinn went to the bedroom to observe the aftermath. He saw Jamie on the floor, bleeding and tangled in curtains from the struggle to survive. Quinn, like the others, believed she was dead. Kimberly was still in the bed, barely alive, bleeding heavily. Christopher knew that they could leave no survivors, so he finished Stephen's attack with a brutal cut across Kimberly's throat. All four men then ransacked the Cates' home, taking jewelry and jewelry boxes. They later sold their spoils at a mall kiosk, claiming to have gotten them from yard sales. They made a whopping $130. As the men exited the home, Jamie remained hidden in the curtains, pretending to be dead. When she was sure she was alone, she struggled to crawl out of the bedroom, down the long hallway to the kitchen, where she found a cell phone. By the time she called 911 at around 4 a.m., she was so weak from her severe injuries that she gave the dispatcher details and then simply left the line open while she waited for help to arrive. First on the scene was Sergeant Kevin Furlong of neighboring Milford. Sergeant Furlong looked through windows in the home and eventually spotted Jamie on the kitchen floor. He couldn't enter, and Jamie was too hurt to get to him. He used all of his strength to barge through the heavy dead-bolted front door. The surgery that he would later need for injuries to his shoulder was worth it. He successfully broke down the door and reached Jamie. She was covered in stab wounds and some wounds which looked to have been from Stephen's machete. Her foot was partially amputated. She had a deep head wound which had cracked her skull. Her elbow was broken and she had a punctured lung. Some sources say she also had a broken jaw. She was lucky to be alive. While first responders were on their way to the crime scene, the murderers and accomplices were driving to Autumn's house in Hollis. They removed their bloody clothes and tried to clean everything off as best they could. They eagerly sorted through what they had stolen from the house. The days after. Later that day, Christopher and Stephen went to see Stephen's friend Kyle Fenton. The two had never met. But that didn't stop Christopher from giving Kyle a detailed account of stabbing Kimberly and Jamie, and even showing him the weapons they used. Kyle didn't entirely believe them, but he still searched online for news of a similar story after the other two left. He was shocked to find reports of a robbery and murder in the neighboring town early that morning. Knowing that this could be more than a coincidence, Kyle told his mom everything, and they both made a report to the police. Meanwhile, Stephen must have realized that they had probably said too much to too many people. They had to get rid of evidence. With Autumn's help, they bagged up the bloody clothes and tossed them in the river and buried the machete and knives. News of the attack was spreading through the small town rapidly. The attackers soon learned that Jamie had survived. Stephen and the others teased Christopher for not being able to kill a little girl, calling him stupid and pathetic. Kyle's report, coupled with Jamie's physical description of the attackers, made it easy for police to quickly hone in on Stephen and Christopher. Police arrived at Stephen's house the next day, where they met Stephen, Christopher, and Autumn. All three agreed to go to the station to speak with detectives, and Christopher agreed to a search of his car. It wasn't long before Quinn's and Billy's names were brought into the mix, and they were brought in for questioning as well. The next few days were a whirlwind for the small towns of Amherst and Mont Vernon. On October 6, Souhegan High School officials were notified that two of their students, Quinn and Billy, had been arrested under suspicion of having been part of the home invasion. Counselors were brought in, and school officials made the decision to postpone that week's state-mandated standardized testing. Neighbors in Mont Vernon reported seeing representatives from home security companies going door-to-door making sales. The town was immediately changed. Children no longer walked alone. Women stopped running at night. And the police department noticed an increase in requests for pistol permits. A sandwich board sign in front of the fire department read, "Mont Vernon is hope." And the town pulled together to organize several fundraisers to help Jamie and David. Services for Kimberly were held on an invitation-only basis. And as a testament to how loved she was, they included around 200 people. Jamie recovered in the ICU in Boston, but would need more surgeries and months of recovery at home. Because the arrests happened within days of the crime, the legal process began while the community's emotional wounds were still very raw. Probable cause hearings were scheduled for October 20 for all suspects. Residents worried what the effects of the media frenzy might be on the very small towns. School officials encouraged SHS students not to attend the hearings. The worries were unnecessary though, as the suspects waived the hearings at the last minute in exchange for their defense attorneys getting access to evidence against them. The trials. Autumn. Billy and Quinn all took plea deals in which they agreed to testify against Stephen and Christopher in exchange for lesser sentences. Stephen's trial began a year after the murder. On October 25, 2010, he was charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, witness tampering, conspiracy to murder, and burglary. In New Hampshire, a first-degree murder conviction comes with a mandatory life sentence without parole. Stephen was offered a plea deal which would have reduced that charge. But he refused on the grounds that he would never plead guilty to any charge related to Jamie. He eventually pleaded not guilty to all charges. Stephen's defense team argued that the state had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and that the testimony from Billy and Quinn could not be trusted because they were motivated to deflect blame away from themselves and place it on him. Billy even admitted to changing his story in the days following the murder, and had been bragging about his part in the attack. Quinn admitted that he did intend to kill someone on the night of the attack, and said that he had a fascination with the Zodiac Killer and Charles Manson. Stephen's defense team latched onto these inconsistencies and personal statements from Billy and Quinn in hopes of making them look like the main culprits. Stephen, the defense said, was a narcissistic braggart. His constant outlandish claims about himself and his part in other crimes made him a convenient scapegoat for Billy and Quinn, who wanted to pin the blame on him. During Stephen's trial, the prosecution presented evidence from medical experts who testified to the weapons used against Kimberly and Jamie, as well as the lifelong injuries that Jamie would likely face. They also presented Stephen, who was adopted, as a nightmare child, who was psychologically imbalanced, had many interactions with the police, and was involved in multiple instances of violence against his own family. Stephen's parents had spent years trying to get him help through different mental health channels, and blamed the system in part for Stephen's actions. Stephen's behavior during the trial earned him admonishment from the judge more than once. He stared down David Cates in the audience, as well as witnesses while they were on the stand. He was animated and visibly intrigued while the coroner showed crime scene photos. His behavior made it clear to the judge and jury that he thrived on shocking and upsetting people. At the conclusion of the trial, on his 19th birthday and after just 90 minutes of deliberation, Jurors delivered guilty verdicts on all charges. Christopher's trial began in early 2011. When he was initially questioned by detectives immediately after the murder, he claimed no responsibility. He stated that he would never break into a house, because he was an Eagle Scout with principles. He referred to himself as gentlemanly, and the sort of guy that even hit girls. His story quickly fell apart though, and he admitted to being involved and even led investigators to the spots where he had helped to destroy evidence. Christopher faced all of the same charges as Stephen, and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. New Hampshire law required him to demonstrate to the jury that he was insane at the time of the attack, which would be a challenge due to the state's unclear legal definition of insanity. Christopher decided to take the stand in his own defense and testified for 11 hours. He testified in detail how precise and focused his attack was. He told jurors of the intention and control that he put into each stab wound, saying that he knew exactly what he was doing and that it was wrong. Prosecutors noted that Christopher failed himself as a witness, because his testimony only showed him to be intelligent and coherent, certainly not insane. Christopher's defense team argued that he had depression and a personality disorder which were exacerbated by a recent breakup. They brought up his devout Mormon upbringing and his achievements as an Eagle Scout as evidence that he was otherwise an upstanding young man. It must have been insanity that drove him to commit the crime. Jurors didn't buy it, and Christopher was found guilty of all charges. The yearbook. At the time of the murders, Billy and Quinn were seniors at Suagan High School in Amherst, NH. Had they continued on the traditional path, they would have been graduates of the SHS class of 2010. The excitement around the typical end-of-year celebrations was disrupted when the yearbook was published. The community was horrified to discover that Billy and Quinn had been included in the yearbook as if nothing had happened. Their pictures were published right alongside their peers, and Quinn had a quarter-page spread dedicated to his thoughts, which read more like a stream of consciousness ramble. Letters to the editor of the local paper were heavily against the decision to include the suspects. Tempers were clearly on display, with opinions such as, "How could we immortalize these animals?" and "The school board should be hung in the town square." There were a few letters in support of the decision, but they read almost resigned to the fact. One supportive writer said that the boys were indeed members of the graduating class. And besides, there were countless other photos in the world that would always tie them to this SHS class and their victims forever anyway. The school board eventually did write a letter apologizing to the community for reopening emotional wounds, and recognizing that the decision was bringing unwarranted negative attention to the celebrations of the graduating seniors. A new publishing policy was put in place soon after, wherein the school board must approve any yearbook publications that might be controversial. Today, Kimberley's legacy is still felt in Mont, Vernon, Amherst, and throughout all of New Hampshire. Locally, the Kimberly Cates Scholarship Foundation awards scholarships to SHS students pursuing careers in healthcare. Local businesses still make donations to that and other fundraisers in her name. Annual music festivals raised funds for Jamie's medical expenses and ongoing contributions to the Scholarship Foundation. In 2011, then-Governor John Lynch signed the Kimberly Cates Law, which expanded the crimes eligible for the death penalty to include murder committed during home invasions. Stephen Spader remains one of the most notorious criminals from New Hampshire. He is housed in a secure unit in a maximum security prison in New Jersey, where he spends 23 hours per day in his cell. He was originally in a New Hampshire prison, but was transferred for undisclosed reasons related to personal or institutional safety. Stephen was assaulted more than once while in prison in New Hampshire, and was known to be disliked due to having harmed a child. Stephen was sentenced to life plus 76 years, and will spend the rest of his life in jail. Billy and Quinn are housed in Vermont. Christopher remains the only one still in New Hampshire. He resides in the SHU in isolation at Concord State Prison. He was moved to a lower security wing at one point, but was involved in a fight with another inmate and moved back to maximum security within a few hours. A personal note. I have been into true crime for a long time. I have lurked on lots of crime subs for years, but this is my first write-up. I was drawn to this case because I live in one of the towns affected. Kimberly's name is still spoken here, and Jamie's name is still in the papers for her work on her mother's foundation. After spending so much time reading about other cases, it was surreal to read and write about this one that is so close to home. The letters to the editor were signed by folks I run into around town. I held the controversial yearbook in my hands. I vote at SHS. There are 3 degrees of separation between me and one of the murderers. Doing this made me see my interest in true crime differently. I found myself carefully choosing words in light of being a neighbor to the victims. It made me think about how distance from these awful crimes that we are so interested in might skew our judgment, or desensitize us to the real suffering involved. Just my thoughts while reflecting on putting this together. Also, this took days. Actual days. I have a new appreciation for those of you who regularly contribute write-ups. Hope you enjoyed.